a fairy story. The shoes that were danced to pieces. And I don't know why exactly, but for years and years and years at this evening class we've treated this as our Christmas story. It's got nothing to do with Jesus, nothing whatsoever. And possibly it feels Christmassy because it's kind of dark in the sense that everything happens underground and there's very little sunshine. And of course this is the dark time of the year. And in olden times this was the festive season because you had to get through winter. And maybe that's why this story seems like the right story for midwinter. And by the way, this particular midwinter, this particular winter solstice is the longest, darkest night, in fact a week of the longest, darkest nights you can have. Every 19 and a half years you get this phenomenon where the darkest day of the month coincides with the darkest day of the year. And there's actually Stonehenge and many other megalithic monuments, you hear about this if you come to our summer lectures on Stonehenge, was designed by as if the engineers had been asked by the shamans, find us the darkest, longest night so we'll see the maximum number of stars. And they worked out it was every 19 and a half years, and Stonehenge was designed to host a massive festival, kind of stargazing festival, with lots of other stuff happening as well as stargazing, to correspond with that especially dark night. Because the dark, for hunter-gatherers especially, and also hunter-gatherers moving towards becoming farmers, the dark time of the month, the dark time of the year, is the magical time.
But it also means that the day after that, everything starts to grow.
And everything starts to grow.
But every 19 years, it grows by moon as well as sun.
That's right, yes. So that's right. So it's like death, the death of the month, the death of the year, and you've somehow got to get through that death in order to get gradually towards new life. We're often asked in the Radical Anthropology Group what exactly it is about us that's radical. And the answer is kind of, from our point of view, is that we're trying to get to the roots of things. I mean, the concept of a radish helps you to understand what we're kind of on about. And by that, it's like, it would be great, in order to understand the whole of human history, if we could understand how it all began. What was the moment when we, evolving humans, became fully conscious of ourselves and others, when we began to develop language, when we established the fundamental principle of all the world's religions, namely that some things are sacred, not everything's up for negotiation. If only we could nail down what it was that happened, and it must have been something quite remarkable, because we are a very, very strange species of animal, then with any luck, the rest of history would make a lot more sense. So that's been our particular focus. And in RAG, many of us, not all of us, but certainly myself and Camilla and many of us who helped found RAG, we have a way of linking up all the different topics that we deal with each term. And this term we've dealt with a wide variety of topics, but the way we try to link them is through this version of human origins theory, which I'm going to just mention before getting into the fairy tale. I mean, perhaps it's not immediately obvious why fairy tales are relevant to human origins. The greatest work on magical myths and fairy tales ever was produced in 4 volumes by a French anthropologist called Claude Lévi-Strauss, who studied 1,000 myths of North and South America. And this is his final volume, The Naked Man. And he gets towards the sort of culmination of the whole extraordinary work. And his last chapter is called One Myth Only. And he worked out that all the world's magical myths and fairy tales, I'll just say a little bit about what that means. It doesn't mean any story, it doesn't mean any account of something which might have happened, but any magical story, any story designed to enchant. And by the way, that kind of means designed for the experience of initiation. Hunter-gatherers go through initiation. Every boy and girl coming of age goes through a very profound experience, which feels like death. And you come out of it, kind of reborn. So, and magical stories are linked to that experience of death and rebirth, which is the experience of being initiated. So taking those as the subject matter, Lévi-Strauss says that all the world's magical myths and fairy tales are variations on a theme. At the end of the day, they are one myth only. It doesn't at all mean it's boring. You keep hearing the same myths. The myths are marvellously varied and different. It's more like saying that all life on Earth is kind of one thing in the sense of the alphabet of life. The genetic code is one, C-G-T-A. It's a code made up of 4 letters. And because those 4 can be combined in a potentially infinite variety of ways, therefore we've got all the differences between fruit flies and giraffes and sponges and elephants, and all of life on Earth is the result of the code being the same. And that's the kind of idea that Lévi-Strauss has when he says that the myths are one myth only. It doesn't mean the stories are all the same. It means there's an underlying structure or logic. Where does that logic come from? Lévi-Strauss himself had 2 ideas. One was that the logic uniting all these stories as some kind of reflection of the genetic architecture of the human brain. Maybe the brain's some kind of digital computer with off and on switches, and as a result of that you get these very sharp contrasts and myths between earth and sky, raw and cooked, male and female, life and death. Maybe it's the architecture of the mind. The human mind maybe has got this particular digital structure, in other words, working with contrast, which constrains the stories. But he also had another theory, and that's that these myths are a kind of echo of a moment, almost like a Big Bang. Astronomers talk about the moment of the origin of the universe, which, strangely enough, we can pick up through its echoes. The whole of the universe as it is now is in some ways an echo or a reflection of how the universe began 14,000 million years ago. In a similar way, maybe, and this is his other theory, all the world's magical myths and fairy tales are echoes of the moment we became fully human, the moment we became symbolically human. Now, I have to say, I prefer that second theory. I don't believe there's anything in the architecture of the human brain which forces us to tell the myths in the way they're constrained. Just to give an example, in the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, Jack goes to bed supperless, and as he's climbing up the beanstalk, he's hungry. And in the earliest versions of the Jack and the Beanstalk story, the narrator makes a huge issue of the fact that he keeps coming up to different leaves with a pub and an ale house, and every time he asks for food, he's told there isn't any, so he's getting more and more hungry. I don't think there's anything about the brain which prevents you from telling a story where Jack goes up the beanstalk and he's feasting at every point, filling his belly with roast beef. I can't see why the brain should stop you from doing kind of anything in the story. And if you're making up a story, why can't anything happen? But if the constraints are historical, maybe there's a reason why certain things work and others don't. And I much prefer that theory, in other words, that when we hear these stories, where it's a bit like tree rings. If you cut a tree and count the rings, you can pick up the history of the climate. You can get the bad winters, the good winters. You can work out what happened maybe in the case of some trees, bristlecone pine trees from California. They can live at 11,000 years. So you can pick up 11,000 years of history by counting the rings and seeing how thick they are. So this other theory, which I think is a much better one, is that these magical myths and fairy tales, they're rich with information about the moment when we became symbolically human. And for some reason, whatever it was that happened became kind of stuck, at least on the level of mythology. Perhaps I should emphasize that in the course of history, the last well over 100,000 years that we've been symbolically human, an enormous amount of stuff has changed, obviously. So you can talk about hunter-gatherers, immediate return hunter-gatherers, those that don't do storage, moving in many areas to storage hunter-gatherers with much more inequality, moving to the earliest forms of farming, moving to city-states, moving to slavery and empires, moving to feudalism, the industrial. So much has changed in the course of all that history. But the most, if you like, time-resistant, the most hard part of ourselves, the part which is most resistant to change, perhaps surprisingly, is religious ideology or cosmology. Our fairy tales kind of don't change. So, for example, in Australia, the story of the rainbow snake, we can trace back the rainbow snake. That's their divinity. It's a great snake, which is also a rainbow, which they say is the mother of all of us. We can find rock art showing that the rainbow snake was prominent in their belief system 11,000 years ago as the ice age was melting and the floods were separating different parts of what was then Greater Australia. And if a story can last 11,000 years, there's not much reason to suppose it couldn't last 60,000 years or even 100,000 years. So that the core of these stories could be very, very old. So what is the core of these stories? What is the structure which Lévi-Strauss eventually comes up with? His different ways of putting it in his extraordinarily rich work, Mythologique. Sometimes he talks about a struggle between the earth and the sky for possession of fire. But there's always a battle between opposites, earth and sky, life and death, raw and cooked, over some treasure. It can be fire, but it can be some other form of treasure. The way I want to put it, building on Lévi-Strauss, is a little bit, just to kind of simplify for everybody. The stories are kind of like this. You have this world. By this world, we mean the world where people are individuals, they've got edges, you've got male, you've got female, you can see what's going on, there's light, you eat, you may be having sex, you've got kids around. It's kind of the ordinary, if you like, world, maybe the world of domestic life. So the stories start off with this everyday world, if you like. And then something happens. And with a flow of blood, usually, or something which, if you investigate the different versions, you'll soon come across a flow of blood. Something triggers, maybe a blood flow, but something triggers a movement into the other world, the world of the dead. And that's not magic. That's just first you're alive and now you're dead. And then comes the magical bit. You come back from the dead. And that is magic. If you can die and come back, the coming back, the resurrection is the magical part of the story. And as I just said earlier, the reason why those stories kind of resonate and the reason why they are so meaningful, the reason why you can regard them as descriptions of reality, is because everyone would have gone through a process of initiation during which you died. And initiation is psychologically real death. You go through the experience of dying and you come out again reborn. Now, while that might be a once-in-a-lifetime experience being initiated, it's actually much more than that, because everyone else that's doing the initiation is also participating in the ritual of initiation, the ritual of going into the world of the dead and coming back again. I've got a little sheet of paper here to show. Can you just take one and pass them round? This is what, in our team, myself, Camilla Power, Ian Watts, and now Jerome Lewis and Ingrid, we came up with as the kind of signature of death and then the signature of life. In other words, it looks as if certain things go together to make up the experience of being in the world of the dead. And other things go together to constitute life in this world. And to make it really simple, getting back to that idea of a kind of digital switch, you can conceptualize it as you've either got the switch of magic casting the spell, it's either switched on, in which case you're moving into the land of the dead, or it's switched off and you're back among the living. And the interesting thing, the thing which makes this theory testable, is that the features of being in the world of the dead seem to be consistent myth after myth after myth after myth. So although the stories change, what you find is again and again and again, the signal of being in the land of the dead is amplified by putting together a number of features. Now, each story doesn't have to have all those features. So, for example, a story doesn't have to have the feature of noise versus silence. But if it does, if the noise is there, the noise is going to go with certain other features which also go with death. So it works out that, and I've got on the left here, what happens is that you're going into seclusion. Going into seclusion can be your initiation ritual. If it's a girl, she's going into seclusion, means she's going into, she's declaring herself and her relatives are declaring her sacred. She's untouchable, she's inviolable, no man can go near her. She's as if she's a kind of divinity. She's out of space and time, somewhere between earth and sky, in a realm of her own. So that's seclusion. And if you're in seclusion, then you're kind of in the realm of the death. You're out of circulation in this world. Of course, the sun or the moon can go into seclusion. You can have an eclipse, and that would go with seclusion. So if you're in seclusion and there's any mention of the sun or the moon, it should be either an eclipsed sun or an eclipsed moon, or it should certainly be dark. And sunlight, if you have bright sunlight during menstrual seclusion, and particularly if the girl in seclusion is hit by sunlight, if the sunlight touches her head, that's kind of cancelling out the power, and it's to be avoided. And very often, and Levi-Strauss makes a huge issue of this, the fear is that if the girl is so powerful, her blood is so powerful, her menstrual blood is so powerful, and so consistent with darkness, that if the sun was to shine on her head, the danger would be that she would actually put out the sun, and that would be disastrous. The sun's quite important. So along with seclusion and eclipse, you have again thunder. So you have a loud noise. The skies are dark. If there is any fire, it won't be cooking fire. It'll be lightning fire, celestial fire, as Levi-Strauss calls it. Noise, chaos, rebellion. So the idea of rebellion is part of this on switch. It's like if you're alive, you're kind of colluding with the world as it is. If you're the dead, even if momentarily intervening in this world, you're upsetting everything and rebelling. Waxing moon, the night, as opposed to full moon or waning moon, night, death. I've come here. Perhaps rather than just go through this, it's all here. These two columns, just to be quick, otherwise we'll never get to the story. And the logic is that signals of the same polarity reinforce one another. If you want to emphasize death, you need to add an item from this column. If you want to emphasize it in the realm of the dead, don't, for example, have marital sex going on. Marital sex doesn't happen. The dead don't do marital sex. They might do some kind of sex, but it certainly isn't marriage. And the Christians made a big point of this. There's no marriage in heaven, for example. You don't want cooked food. If you're dead, in the world of the dead, everything should be raw, bleeding. If in the world of the dead, your human identity as male or female is transformed. You can be, if it's in the land of the dead, you might be an animal. You might have switched your gender. So gender ambivalence, species ambivalence belongs with this movement into the other world. It's not that you can't mix things up. It's just that if you do mix things up, you're going to weaken the signal. So it's simply like saying that in the stories, the narrators want the signals to be loud and clear, and insofar as the signals are loud and clear, you'll find they don't make mistakes. You don't mix a plus with a minus, in which case you get, you just get something. You just get neutrality. You just get everything cancelled out. So signals of the same polarity reinforce one another. Signals of opposite polarity cancel out, and we expect in these stories the quietest possible off to alternate with the loudest possible on. That'll make the signal of the story clearest if you don't sort of muddle up the two columns. Is that fairly clear? And with any luck, if this theory is correct, you won't find a story from Grimm's or from any other culture which violates that basic syntax. This is almost like the genetic code of world mythology, except it's just got a 0 and a 1 instead of 4 letters of the alphabet. Right? I've got little exercises here. Sometimes we do this, we just do the exercises. So, should seclusion go with cooking? No. When you're in seclusion, you're bleeding. And if it's a boy, you'll still be bleeding, maybe a nosebleed or something, but you certainly won't be cooking, because cooking means, for hunter-gatherers, it means taking meat, which is bleeding, which is bloody, and the whole point of cooking is to remove the blood. So adding blood, your own blood, to the cooking process is obviously going to cancel out the cooking. It's not going to work, so you won't find that. And by the way, just to cut a long story short, as far as we can tell, Jason Wilcox is one of us who's done a lovely pamphlet. He did a master's on all this. He studied horror films, and he found that this syntax is beautifully respected. And indeed other films. If you take Jurassic Park, for example, all the dinosaurs. They're female dinosaurs. They're eating people. You don't have a sunny. It's not a sunny day with white cotton clouds in the blue sky. It's a thunderstorm. It's eclipse. Everything's wet. Huge roaring noises, and people are getting eaten by these female dinosaurs. It's that the filmmakers kind of know what works and what doesn't. It's not that you can't defy the logic, it's just that maybe you won't make such a box office hit if your film doesn't kind of resonate with all the other stories which we've heard since childhood. To make the story work, you don't want to interfere with what's already in your head. And so the people who know what they're doing with horror films and other films kind of, maybe unconsciously, they seem to respect this logic. Now, I want to put this in a slightly different way because we've been having some wonderful lectures the last 3 weeks from Jerome Lewis and his wife Ingrid. And these are two anthropologists, and they've spent more time among hunter-gatherers than almost anyone else I know, with the one exception of James Woodburn, who, by the way, is the father of hunter-gatherer ethnography, who came along last week, and who's giving the second lecture next term. He's about 90, but he's making his way down from Cambridge to give us a talk about the story of his studies of the Hadza. He's only just come back from seeing the Hadza. But now the Hadza aren't quite the same. The Hadza are in Tanzania, they're bow and arrow hunters on the savannah, hunting giraffe and zebra. Jerome Lewis studies forest people in the Congo. And those of you who were here last week remember the brief film showing. How many of you were here last week and remember this film showing, all those girls doing right, okay, great. So that was called Ngoku. That was the women's ritual. Just remind me, because not everyone may remember, what were those girls and women? There's a big gaggle of them. What were they up to?
You don't want to say, do you?
What were they doing? Remind me. What were they doing this week?
Ridiculing men.
They were what?
Ridiculing men.
And how were they ridiculing men?
They had sticks that pretended to be penises and going around acting out male behaviour.
That's right. They were making fun of men by acting out male behaviour, and the males they were acting out, they were really pretty badly behaved males, weren't they? I mean, so what you have with these are the people who are called the Benjeli. They're a group of the Yaka and Pygmy forest people. They have two rituals, well, they have many rituals, but fundamentally they have the women's ritual, which is a rebellion. It's a female rebellion against badly behaved males. Very sexy, but the sexiness is for the women. It's absolutely, taunting the men in all kinds of ways at men's expense. And you can see in the film, you were seeing the men being a little bit embarrassed, some of them more so than others. But it's a humorous teasing, taunting of the opposite sex. What happens is that the women, with those rituals, they take over the entire space. So Ngoku means it's almost a matriarchy. For a period, women rule, and they rule by reversing their gender, play acting it being male, and taunting the men. The key thing is that the women, having taken that power, they don't keep it. What they do is that after a while, maybe 3 or 4 nights, they let go and allow the men to enter centre stage with their own ritual, which is called Ejengi. And the Ejengi is kind of muscular, and the men are sort of showing off their physical prowess and their strength, particularly as hunters. And so what you get is what Morna Finnegan, who gave a lecture here last year, calls communism in motion. Instead of having communism, and in many ways these hunter-gatherers are communists. I mean, they're assertively egalitarian, they share everything. So in many ways you could say communism is an appropriate description. But their communism isn't static. It's not like the women say, okay, we've established a sharing way of life, we've established gender equality, and now we're going to sit back and we've had our revolution, we're going to leave it there. What happens is much more interesting. The women rebel with their bodies, with their laughter, with their taunting, with their gender reversal, take over the space for a period, and the boys and the men kind of, run for protection in some cases, run back to their huts or hide, or too embarrassed to hang around too much. And then the women on purpose surrender to the men. And the men come in with their much more physical, potentially violent ritual, because it's potentially violent because the men are showing off what potentially good hunters they are. And so you've got this pendulum, and that's what Morna means by communism in motion. The women take over for a period and then let go in order to let the men take over, in order to be able to have the revolution all over again. In other words, if the women just took over and you had a matriarchy and the women just held on to power, you'd lose the revolution, you'd lose the fun. It's almost as if the women want the men to take over as a kind of dominant sex so that those men can be overthrown again, because that is such fun to do that. So you get this alternation between a potential hierarchical system and a potential male dominant system, but the male dominance is only, let's pretend, it's not allowed to last very long. Right. What we now think is that the on signal and the off signal correspond to those two rituals. The on signal, we've already got it there, rebellion. It's rebellion against, in a way, against primate nature. You could argue that if political power is all about physical strength, physical dominance, then it's natural for the male sex to dominate the female. You can make an argument like that, and in fact many monkeys and apes tend to be male dominated, even when there's quite a strong matrilineal element of kinship. Still, the males, very often, not always, but mostly, tend to dominate. So what happens is that dominance gets resisted. And now just getting back to human origins. There are many theories of how we became human, and most of them we kind of line bits off, but we don't really, in RAG, we think they're all very partial. So you can have man the toolmaker, for example, and so you have the tool-making ape, the thinking ape, the talking ape. Another theory is called the lopsided ape, that to do with the fact we have left brain and right brain. The naked ape. All these different theories. Mostly they're about man being, naked or making tools or whatever. So these theories are good because they're simple, but they don't put things together very well, and they're certainly not interesting as far as fairy tales are concerned. The man, the toolmaker, naked ape, doesn't tell you anything at all about the shoes that were danced to pieces, Jack the Beanstalk, Cinderella. These are absolutely useless because they don't say anything about social life, sexual life, belief, ritual, cosmology. They say nothing at all. So in RAG, as I say, most of us in RAG, we have an equally simple theory, and it can put it in one word: resistance. 3 words: generalize the resistance. So, all right, resistance, but resistance to what? And we're saying resistance precisely to dominance. So with our primate relatives, chimpanzees and other primates, the social system is called dominance. Dominance is a measure of how much one individual can exclude rivals from a valuable space. So if you can shove others out, your rivals out of the way in order to get to the food or in order to get to the sex, it means you're dominant. But wherever you have dominance, you're going to get resistance. And resistance is always a bit different, because resistance means forming a coalition. In order to resist being dominated, it's best to form an alliance with somebody that's also being dominated and that doesn't want to be dominated. And now the sex comes in, because the dominance is always, in some measure, sexual. And very often, as with common chimpanzees, you have male sexual dominance over the females. But now and again the females band together and resist that dominance. And what we're saying is that in the human case, resistance to being dominated built and built and built, and that's called counter-dominance. And eventually there came a point, for reasons we won't go into now, where what's called counter-dominance culminated in reverse dominance, where the coalition resisting being dominated was so broad, so all-embracing, so inclusive, that it became society. The coalition, the only dominant force in society, the only part of society which could legitimately use violence, was the entire community using the threat of violence against any individual or group of individuals attempting to use violence against others, and that's reverse dominance. So what we see with the Mengele, what we were seeing last week, was that rebellion against dominance is led by women. It's linked to the moon. Women's biggest husband is the moon. What the women say is that once a month women are with their biggest husband, that means they don't need men, they're with their other husband. The moon is their other husband. That's how they put it, not just with the Mengele, but with so many other different hunter-gatherer groups. So once a month, if you like, women are resisting. And now just think about it, is the theory we have. If you're resisting, if women are using their power, and this is what Jerome says as well, those women we saw in the film, they're banding together they're celebrating being sexy, but they're emphatically in control over their own bodies and their own availability. And during those rituals, goku, women are on sex strike. Now, if you think about it, you're on sex strike in order to get the males to behave. There's no point being on sex strike over here if the other women over there are not on sex strike. The men will just move over to where women aren't on sex strike. So in order to make your sex strike effective, your strike action has got to be a general strike. How do you organise a general strike on a sexual basis once a month? Well, you need a clock. And the moon is the obvious clock. The sun wouldn't work. You can't go on sex strike like once a day or once a year. That's not sufficient. But once a month makes a lot of sense. And if you organise the strike action for dark moon, it makes a lot of sense, because then you can signal to the men you're not getting any sex until you behave, you're not getting any sex until you make yourself useful, and in particular we want you to go away, go hunting, stay out several nights maybe, and if you come back around full moon with a zebra wanting sex, maybe we'll think about it. And so you get this alternation between being on strike, being rebellious, and then on the other hand, you don't want to be on strike all the time, because sex is fun, and so is so are men, so is women, and so is eating the big feast. So you want to end all those taboos, and the logical time to end the taboos is full moon, because full moon gives you all night to go hunting, and no one would dream in Africa of going out hunting when it's dark moon, because the lions have got fantastic night vision, and you'll be their meal, and you won't be eating anything at all. You'll be in somebody's belly, probably a lion's belly. So you have this alternation between dark moon and full, waxing moon and waning. And so now, getting to life and death. Can you see what's happening? In the story I'm going to be reading out, as in all the other stories, so think of the Sleeping Beauty. The spell lasts 100 years. There's a great hedge of thorns around the entire palace. There's Beauty sleeping. Everyone's still kind of, we discussed at the beginning of the term, normal life has come to a halt. It's like a general strike. Big, picket line of thorns all around. The young men keep thinking they can come in and find this maiden and maybe have sex with her, but they get tangled up with the thorns, and that's the end of them. But it only lasts 100 years. But during that 100 years, it's as if everyone's in the land of the dead. Or then think of Little Red Riding Hood. Little Red Riding Hood goes into the forest. She meets somebody that she thinks might be her grandmother, but of course it's the big bad wolf. And for a while, she's in the belly of the wolf, and then she comes out again. And then so many other stories. Now the interesting thing is that while in these stories the boy or the girl, and they're usually in the Grimm's at any rate, many other stories, they're just the age of initiation. They're just the age when a young woman, a young man is becoming sexually aware. He goes through this initiation. While you're in the realm of the dead, what's interesting is that you're almost more alive than ever. You're alive in a different way. Your edges have gone, your boundaries have gone. You're no longer an individual person. You're part of the belly of the wolf. You're maybe part of everybody else. But you're certainly, in some sense, alive. So you're dead to one life, but in dying to that ordinary life, you're becoming alive to a completely different life. And so that's what we find in the stories. And if you ask, why is it that in the land of the dead you don't eat? Why is it in the land of the dead you don't have marriage? Why is it in the land of the dead there's not a lot of sunlight? Can you see what's happening? It's because you move into that realm beyond the everyday realm at dark moon. Dark moon is the time for the shedding of menstrual blood. Everyone's coming together, linked by blood, not by marriage. It's as if you're in the womb of the great All-Mother. There might be lots of intimacy, but it's not going to be marital sex. It'll be a different kind of intimacy, the kind that you might have inside your mother's womb. And all these features of the on signal, you can just see how logically they apply. I mean, for example, why aren't you cooking meat? Well, because you haven't got any meat. Because you don't get that till the men come back, from the hunting grounds around full moon, and then the spell breaks. You light the fires, you cook the meat, you remove the blood from the meat. That makes it available to be consumed. Women equally are available, as are men. So all the taboos, if you like, are lifted, and you get what we call the off signal here. An emergence from seclusion, the midday sun, no more noises, harmony. Instead of rebellion, you don't need a rebellion now, because you've won the fruits of that rebellion, waning moon and so on and so forth, marital sex, of course, in that column. So if that theory is true, every single one of the world's magical myths and fairy tales should respect that logic. I keep asking people to come up with exceptions. And so far, we haven't found any. It's not that you can't have being eaten by a dinosaur in a sunny day. It's just that if the sun's shining, it's somehow, part of that signal is weakened. It's much better because inside the belly of a dinosaur it probably is very dark, much better to emphasize that with dark skies, thunder, wetness, and all the other things which are part of the experience of being in the womb of this belly of this wolf or dinosaur or whatever it is. Having said all that, why don't I start with the shoes that were danced to pieces. And I particularly love this story. I've got two translations. For my birthday a couple of weeks ago, I was given by two comrades in rank Philip Pullman's new lovely translation. I'm sorry to say that although it is a lovely translation and it takes away some of the Victorian language and maybe makes it easier to read, I still prefer my much older translation. And just for one example, in the story, a lot of young ardent princes, rather like in the story of the Sleeping Beauty. Remember the Sleeping Beauty, these young men, they arrive at the hedge of thorns and they think they can get off their horse and take their sword out and chop through the hedge and get to beauty, and they get impaled. I think the impaling is kind of part of the lesson of the story, and it needs to be nice and loud and clear. Well, in this story, we have princes who arrive thinking they can I don't want to spoil the story, but the princes think they can marry one of these 12 princesses and travel with him into the underground. I'll tell the story in a minute. And what happens is that they get their heads chopped off. Well, I like that. And in this story, instead of saying, and his head was chopped off, it simply says he forfeited his life. And I know that's more politically correct because beheading is a very unpleasant thing to happen. But if you have the image of somebody's head being chopped off, it actually conveys the spilling of the blood and the finality of the event in a way which forfeiting your life doesn't. So if you'll excuse me, I'll read the more bloodthirsty version. So, the shoes that were danced to pieces. What would be quite good is if you remember as many details as you can, because we're going to try and go through the details of this story. Just to say, once again, drawn back now on Claude Lévi-Strauss. Claude Lévi-Strauss says these stories know what they're talking about. Every last detail is there for a reason. And if you don't understand the detail, that's your problem. It's my problem. It's our problem. It's not the myth's problem. The myth is getting it right. So the details need to be heard, registered, and we need to be able to explain them. And all I'm saying is that this time-resistant syntax, it ought to help. And perhaps just one more thing before I read the story. Remember, just remind me, where does a loud noise go according to the syntax? Does it go with death, with life?
Death.
It goes with death. So a lot of descriptions of the death of Jesus, the huge thunderstorms and eclipse, and people in different parts of northern Europe used to bang chair legs against tables to make a huge noise corresponding to death. And again, Lévi-Strauss again describes this, and across huge parts of North America, when you have an eclipse of the sun or an eclipse of the moon, you have to make lots of loud noises. And they rationalise that by saying because the wolf is eating the sun, or the bear is eating the sun or the moon, you have to make loud noises to frighten the bear away or the wolf away. It doesn't really matter too much what these rationalisations are. The point is that if it's an eclipse of the sun or the moon, and also actually if it's dark moon, there needs to be some noise. And going back to Jerome and the Bengeli and the Hadza in Africa, we know from what Jerome was saying, women make a huge amount of noise every month at dark moon. And then the noise they make is polyphonic singing. But the women say, do you remember that? Do you remember what Jerome said when he asked the women, why do you sing so loudly when it's dark? And the women said, we're singing for our lives. In other words, when the women go out, especially if it's dark, or even if they're not going out, they're just in the camp, they want the lions to know there's lots of women here and don't mess with us. So you do lots of polyphonic singing. But you don't do that at the full moon because you can see where you're going and the lions will be following you because they can be seen. So the noise part of it is crucial, and there is going to be some noise in this story. The shoes that were danced to pieces. There was once upon a time a king who had 12 daughters, each one more beautiful than the other. They all slept together in one chamber. in which their beds stood side by side, and every night, when they were in them, the king locked the door and bolted it. But in the morning, when he unlocked the door, he saw that the shoes were worn out with dancing, and no one could find out how that had come to pass. Then the king caused it to be proclaimed that whosoever could discover where they danced at night should choose one of them for his wife, and be king after his death. But that whosoever came forward and had not discovered it within 3 days and nights should have forfeited his life. It was not long before a king's son presented himself and offered to undertake the enterprise. He was well received, and in the evening was led into a room adjoining the princess's sleeping chamber. His bed was placed there, and he was to observe where they went and danced. And in order that they might do nothing secretly or go away to some other place, the door of their room was left open. But the eyelids of the prince grew heavy as lead, and he fell asleep. And when he awoke in the morning, all 12 had been to the dance. For their shoes were standing there with holes in the soles. On the second and third nights there was no difference, and then his head was struck off without mercy. Many others came after this and undertook the enterprise, but all forfeited their lives. Now it came to pass that a poor soldier who had a wound and could serve no longer, found himself on the road to the town where the king lived. There he met an old woman who asked him where he was going. "I hardly know myself," answered he, and added in jest, "I had half a mind to discover where the princesses danced their shoes into holes, and thus I could become king." "That is not so difficult," said the old woman. "You must not drink the wine which will be brought to you at night, and must pretend to be sound asleep." With that she gave him a little cloak and said, "If you wear this, you will be invisible, and then you could steal after the 12. When the soldier had received this good advice, he fell to in earnest, took heart, went to the king, and announced himself as a suitor. He was as well received as the others, and royal garments were put upon him. He was conducted that evening at bedtime into the antechamber, and he was about to go to bed. And as he was about to go to bed, the eldest came and brought him a cup of wine. But he had tied a sponge under his chin, and let the wine run down into it without drinking a drop. Then he lay down, and when he had lain a while, he began to snore as if in the deepest sleep. The 12 princesses heard that and laughed, and the elder said he too might as well have saved his life. With that they got up, opened wardrobes, presses, cupboards, and brought out pretty dresses, dressed themselves before the mirrors, sprang about, and rejoiced at the prospect of the dance. Only the youngest said, "I know not how it is. You are very happy, but I feel very strange. Some misfortune is certainly about to befall us." "You're a goose. You're always frightened," said the eldest. "Have you forgotten how many kings' sons have already come here in vain? I had hardly any need to give the soldier a sleeping draught. The booby wouldn't have woken up anyway." When they were all ready, they looked carefully at the soldier, but he closed his eyes and did not move or stir, so they felt themselves safe enough. The eldest then went to her bed and tapped it, whereupon it immediately sank into the earth. And one after the other they descended through the opening, the eldest going first. The soldier, who had watched everything, tarried no longer, put on his little cloak, and went down last with the youngest. Halfway down the steps, he just trod a little on her dress. She was terrified at that and cried out, "What is that? Who's pulling at my dress?" "Don't be so silly," said the eldest. "You caught it on a nail." Then they went all the way down, and when they were at the bottom, they were standing in a wonderful, pretty avenue of trees, all the leaves of which were of silver, and shone and glistened. The soldier thought, "I must carry a token with me," and broke off a twig from one of them, on which the tree cracked with a loud report. The youngest cried out again, "Something is wrong, didn't you hear the crack?" But the elder said, "It is a gun, fired for joy, because we have got rid of our prince so quickly." After that they came into an avenue where all the leaves were of gold, and lastly into a third where they were of bright diamonds. He broke off a twig from each, which made such a crack each time that the youngest started back in terror, but the eldest still maintained that they were gun salutes. They went on and came to a great lake, whereon stood 12 little boats, and in every boat sat a handsome prince, all of whom were waiting for the 12, and each took one of them with him, but the soldier seated himself by the youngest. Then her prince said, "I wonder why the boat is so much heavy today. I shall have to row with all my strength if I am to get it across." "What should cause that?" said the youngest. "But the warm weather. I feel very warm too." On the opposite side of the lake stood a splendid, brightly lit castle, from whence resounded the joyous music of trumpets and kettle drums. They rode there, entered, and each prince danced with a girl he loved. But the soldier danced with them unseen, and when one of them had a cup of wine in her hand, he drank it up, so that the cup was empty when she carried it to her mouth. The youngest was alarmed at this, but the eldest silenced her. So think about the wine, whether you should drink it, or whether you shouldn't, when. That's all. They danced there till 3 o'clock in the morning, when all the shoes were danced into holes, and they were forced to leave off. The princes rowed them back again over the lake, and this time the soldier seated himself by the eldest. On the shore they took leave of their princes and promised to return the following night. When they reached the stairs, the soldier ran on in front and lay down in his bed. And when the 12 had come up slowly and wearily, he was already snoring so loudly that they could all hear him, and they said, "So far as he's concerned, we're safe." They took off their beautiful dresses, laid them away, put the worn-out shoes under the bed, and lay down. Next morning the soldier was resolved not to speak, but to watch the wonderful goings-on, and again went with them a second and a third night. Then everything was just as it had been the first time, and each time they danced until their shoes were worn to pieces. But the third time he took away a cup with him as a token. When the hour had arrived for him to give his answer, he took the 3 twigs and the cup and went to the king. But the 12 stood behind the door and listened for what he was going to say. When the king put the question, "Where have my 12 daughters danced their shoes to pieces in the night?" he answered, "In an underground castle with 12 princes," and related how it had come to pass, and brought out the tokens. The king then summoned his daughters and asked them if the soldier had told the truth. And when they saw that they were betrayed, and that falsehood would be of no avail, they were obliged to confess all. Thereupon the king asked which of them he would have to wife. He answered, "I'm no longer young, so give me the eldest." Then the wedding was celebrated on the self-same day, and the kingdom was promised him after the king's death. But the princes were bewitched for as many days as they had danced nights with the 12.
Say that last bit again.
The princes had danced 3 nights with the 12 princesses, hadn't they? And at the marriage, the princes underground were bewitched for the same length of time. So the soldier is up here, having been married, and all those other princes in the underworld.
Their heads cut off?
No, they haven't had their heads cut off. No, these are the princes that were danced with during the night, but they loved the princesses and they had a great time in the underworld. But I don't think their heads are cut off. They're under a spell. Doesn't say their heads are cut off. Those are the other guys. But maybe we can start with that. Maybe we can start with, as you'll see from here, what kind of sex do you have when you're dead?
Incest or girls?
That's right. You have a kind of collective sex, which is with your own people. Now we saw that really last week, I think, with Ngoku. I mean, all those girls were acting like being boys. They were having sex, but it was like playful. They were all in a big bunch doing it. And you can sort of see how, if there were going to be any boys, they would be their brothers. You know, it's not about marriage. This is about keeping marital partners way off because it's an initiation ceremony. Okay. I'm not saying we saw any boys there. There weren't any boys. It was a women's ritual. But all I'm saying is, in this model here, in this thing here, if there is going to be intimacy, it's not going to be marital intimacy. It's going to be intimacy with the blood, with your mum, and when you're inside your mum, of course, you're with if you're twins anyway, you're with your brother or sister, but you're certainly in the same room as your brothers and sisters. So being connected to your mum means you're connected with your brothers and sisters. So I don't want to call it incest. Obviously, that's a sociological term which has got no place here. But you have to think of some form of sex which is with the blood, and the word which the anthropologists use, including Levi-Strauss, is that it's incest. And you will always find the heart of the stories, the climax, the most magical bit, is very intimate, but it's like intimacy with your grandmother, who seems to be turning into a wolf. It's not marital bliss. It's something really very different. And where does marriage happen in these stories? When does marriage take place? In all these stories, by the way.
At the end.
At the end.
Mm-hmm.
So marriage means it's all petering out. Okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So marriage means, oh my, this is boring. We're getting back to this world again. The exciting stuff, the thrilling stuff, is nothing to do with marriage, right?
So marriage is the resolution in a sense.
Marriage is like the anticlimax. You have a climax. You have, first of all, you just in this world.
Yeah.
Then you go into the other world, the land of the dead, and that's really, really thrilling and exciting. You'll never forget that in all your life. And then that paves the way for getting married. But in the stories, they got married and they all lived happily ever after, and that's when the whole thing sort of peters out.
So I've got a question, something's nagging at me. What is the utilitarian purpose of the other world? Maybe I've missed it.
Well,
Holiday.
well, Jill's not so
Right.
wrong, okay? It's like what you have with hunter-gatherers is that the women go on strike. It's not like with Christianity, once you're a wife, you're always a wife. You said yes at your marriage, therefore you're available. Therefore you can't be raped in marriage because you said yes long ago. They don't have that view at all. Hunter-gatherer women are just like they're enchanted themselves. So they like sex, but on the other hand, if they don't want sex, there's no sex, and then they all band together to make sure no sex is going to happen. So the way I think of that, being coming from a Marxist background, is like sometimes you just want to go on strike. You know, sex, just because your husband wants it. Now and again, you want to go on sex strike, cooking strike, childcare. You just want to go on strike completely. And then if the men respect that, and you've got to make them respect it, maybe they'll treat you a bit more respectfully.
How do you explain the male side of it then? When the male do, because I don't think this is just a female thing. I think this is a human thing.
Yes, that's right. Well, the way we've seen that with the Benjeli, the men in principle you could say they could just use violence against the women. But of course, a man that started using violence against the women, he's not going to be very popular with the other men, because then he'd probably take all the women, or at least a whole bunch of them, and then the other men's sort of collective jealousy will be coming into play, and it ends up with the men actually supporting the women in that. But I mean, discussing this is going back to the big theory behind all this, which we can do. Yeah. But the fact is that, well, all right, hunter-gatherers, we now know, for tens of thousands of years, women live with mother. It didn't, not like with farmers, where you woman get up sticks and goes to live with her husband, and then he's got her in his own camp. Women stick with the mother, and if you're sticking with your mother, you've got your relatives around, including, of course, your brothers. Because, so your brother, you can always call on your brothers to back you up in a dispute with your husband. So your sex strike, if you need to go on sex strike, and we're suggesting that the belief system is correct, that once a month women would, on purpose, signal, our husband is the moon, we're sacred, this is our moon time, go away, you men. But if the men didn't listen, women could always call on their sons and brothers for a bit of extra physical support to make sure that they were secure. But the question now, we're trying to do two things. We didn't have too much on all this in the last term. We didn't go into all these details of the theory, background theory. But in a sense, it's all in this story. Okay, for example, who are the 12 princes in the story? There's no obvious incest motive, is there, in the story? In a way, there should be, because with Little Red Riding Hood, she's in the belly of the wolf, with all these other stories, and Menstruation makes a big point of this. This kind of intimacy is always the core of the magic. In this story, we don't have that explicit. But who are those 12 princes? There's 12 of them.
Is it the month?
Sorry?
Are they representing the month in some sort of way?
Well, I mean,
Holy Apostles.
They're brothers, aren't they? Or kin.
Yes, I mean, they're the opposite of husbands. Mm-hmm. Because the husbands, we know who the husbands are, they keep getting their heads chopped off.
Yeah, but why 12?
Well, that's another. I agree. 12. They're actually 12 and 1, aren't they? There's 12, and then there's the old grandmother, who portrays them, who tells the soldier, and you could also say there's 12 and 1 because the 12 princes are accompanied as well, aren't they, by the wounded soldier? So there's 12 and 1, which is, I mean, yes, I agree with you. Probably the 12. There's some kind of reference to the 12 moons. 13 moons in a year. But I still want to know who those men are, and because they're not husbands, we have to assume, I think, because in anthropological kinship theory, you've only got two categories. Everyone's related to you. If these men over there are not husbands, they must be brothers. If they're not brothers, they must be husbands. You've got men you can have sex with and men you can't have sex with. These women seem to be having some kind of flirtation, some kind of romance, some kind of dancing all night with brothers. And it's making clear the brothers actually are in love with their sisters. It doesn't say they had sex, does it? But it's sort of, it's romantic. It's like a different kind of relationship. What does the story say about marriage? Are the women keen on marriage? Where does marriage come into the story?
Punishment.
Is that right?
End of freedom or something like that.
This story is making it clear that from the point of view of the women, their freedom is ended. Marriage is the punishment you get for being found out. Okay? The women loved going down in this big, all these joined up beds, sinking down to the earth and having a whale of a time, dressing up, all their finery. There's nothing said at all about the women want to get married. The king tells them they've got to get married, and presumably they do, but the joy of life seems to have nothing to do with getting married.
They won't be able to take drugs and go to underground parties anymore.
Something like that, yes. Something like that, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Raves, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I've got 2 daughters and they had a whale of a time and then they got married. I'm not saying they didn't have, very fond of their boyfriends and ended up marrying them and so on, but they certainly had a whale of a time when they were going to parties all the time. That's natural for people, that's one of the things which marriage does is it closes off all kinds of avenues, doesn't it? Is that kind of understood? I don't think it's particularly controversial.
Closes you down.
Right, what else do we need to work out? The noises. Why? How often do you get loud noises in the story? Yep, go on.
Whenever heads are chopped off, I guess.
I think chopping off somebody's head probably causes a loud noise. Okay, when do you get noises that sound like cannon being fired?
Snapping of the twigs.
And how often does that happen? 3 times. Now, okay, now we get another question. Why 3? I mean, has anyone any idea?
3 is a habit.
Sorry?
Rule of 3 is a habit.
Yeah. All right. Let's try to put it together with the wine. It doesn't say what colour wine is. It could be white wine, I suppose. But what colour do you think the wine is? Probably. I think it's got to be red. I don't think white wine would work at all. Okay, so you've got this red wine, and you've got the heads being chopped off, and the 2 things seem to go together. If you're in this world and you drink the red wine, which is kind of like blood, there seems to be quite a lot more blood because your head gets chopped off. Right, and you've also got this key motif in the whole story: the shoes with holes in the soles. What does the shoe motif in fairy tales kind of represent? I mean, we've got Cinderella, but there's lots of other stories, and Freud has got a few things to say about shoes, especially with holes in the soles, and remembering that these stories are always quite bawdy and quite adult in many ways because they're about getting initiated into adult life. I mean, I don't know exactly, but I mean, shoe, according to Freud, and lots of folklorists have said the same thing, is a vagina symbol. It certainly is with Cinderella, whether you can fit into it or not fit into it, all that stuff. And if it's got a hole in it, it's like you're leaking. And if you're leaking, and it's something to do with blood and wine and stuff, it's probably something to do with menstruation, which is, of course, a huge taboo for us here. But for hunter-gatherers, it's a massively potent signal.
Do they have shoes?
Hunter-gatherers wear bits of car tire. You just cut up a bit of car tire and you put it on your... But no, I mean, you're right, probably. Earlier on, they wouldn't have bothered with shoes too much. You get very, very thick heels.
So, sorry, going back to the 3, what does the 3 then?
Right, okay, so now what does 3 mean? When do you menstruate? According to the cosmological ideal. Woman's biggest husband is the moon, according to Jerome Lewis with the Vangeli. By the way, the Hadza that I've been with, Camilla's worked with the Hadza, they say that you can only have the big Epime ceremony, the main ceremony that constructs the identity of the Hadza people. These are probably the world's last bow and arrow hunters, or among the last. But they have their main ritual can only be held during the period of the dark moon. The moon has to be set down behind the horizon. There has to be no light pollution. You have to be able to see the stars. Then you can have your ritual. How many nights are you going to get in a row with absolutely no moon through the whole night?
3.
Most areas, okay. So 3 times you have the dark moon, 3 times you have the ritual, 3 times you have the blood, 3 times you have the death, 3 times you have the loud noises. And then after that period of dark moon, you see the new moon setting in the evening, don't you? And that's the end of the period of seclusion or death. So 3 loud noises, because loud noises go with death, for reasons which we can get back to in terms of like surviving in the African savannah against the lions and all that stuff. And also because you want to make sure that people aren't having marital sex. And the way to stop marital sex is to make huge loud, lots of, don't let anyone have any peace and quiet. Bang all the drums you've got and make all the loud noises you can and sing together, rather as we saw with the Goku ritual in the film last week. Are there any other parts of the story that need to be decoded? Are there any other things? All right, what about the wine? In the story, can you see a contradiction? Should you or shouldn't you, if you're trying to spy on these women and steal their secrets, should you or should you not be drinking red wine?
Shouldn't.
What happens in the underworld?
Control the red wine.
He keeps stealing people's wine, doesn't he? And drinking it. So it's like, in this world, you shouldn't make contact with that red substance. But in the other world, you can get away with it. Which makes some sense, doesn't it? I mean, if it's blood. Okay. So, yeah? I mean, certainly there's a contrast there between, when he's in the underworld, he's safe, and he's wearing his invisible coat. He keeps playing tricks by taking people's wine glasses, drinking it, and giving them back the empty glass. It makes that very clear. But if you do that in this world, you'll fall asleep and your head gets chopped off. Yeah. So when in the underworld, it's like you're already asleep. Okay? Or at least you're already dead to this world anyway.
He'd be ridiculously drunk. He'd have to have 12 each time. Because there's 12 sisters.
Yeah.
He'd be really, really drunk.
No, he doesn't nick all the glasses. Maybe just.
Oh, okay. No, each time.
What else? Okay, of course, there's
Who's the old woman?
there's another motif. Do you remember? Tell me what happens in Jack and the Beanstalk. What does Jack goes up? How many times does he go to the sky in Jack and the Beanstalk? He goes up to the sky. Don't you remember Jack and the Beanstalk? I know these stories. He goes up 3 times to the sky. What does he do up there?
Steals 3 different things.
Yes. Okay, what's the famous line, the mantra? Fee, fi, fo, fum. I smell the blood of an Englishman. So the blood's up there. He's like food for the giant. He hides in ovens and various other cupboards and stuff. But what he does is he steals. What did he do? He steals. He steals the heart which plays by itself, the goose that lays the golden eggs, and the bag of gold. And he comes down from the sky having seized those 3 items. What happens in this story?
The trees are silver, gold, and diamond.
That's right. When you're in the night sky, what do you see up in the sky? You see all these diamonds, don't you? You see some of them a little bit more blue, some of them a bit more yellow. It's like, it's as if they're trees with diamonds, but you pluck them as treasures from the other world, and you bring them down to this world, and it gives you the right to marry, and actually in this story to become king. So these tokens stolen from women's sphere give the man who's managed to deceive the women or find some way of finding out their secrets, the power to enforce marriage, or to get the king to enforce marriage. So the man, the hero of the story, if he's a man, steals women's secrets, comes back to this world, exposes their secrets, and benefits with his own royal power from that. So where do men get their ritual power from this underworld, which initially has something to do with women, and men have to steal it. And this is a story about how that was done.
But it's only because the old lady helps them.
So, what about that old lady? She's kind of a traitor, isn't she, to the 12 sisters. She gives this man the knowledge, the invisible cloak, and the secrets of how to avoid getting drunk. So she's like a betwixt and between person who manages to shift over from a time when marriage didn't happen to a time when marriage has become the rule, and this other kind of excitement in the underworld isn't allowed anymore.
In other fairy tales, there's this role played by an old woman, isn't there? Isn't there one in Rumpelstiltskin?
Yes, and yes, that's right. So I mean, the thing is, it's usually an old woman who has those secrets, and a man who wants to be in charge of things, he can only get that magic, if he's informed by an old woman who has that knowledge that the other people don't have.
So that implies what you said, which is that it's supposed to oscillate between male and female, so that the old lady gives away the power again.
Yes, but of course what happens is that when the power is given away, they take it, the king and his successor take it. So again, with these stories, you get a kind of communism of motion. You get a periodicity, a rhythm. This world, the other world. This world, the other world. Life, death, alternating. At the end of the story, the sky and the earth, life and death, separate. And it's made very clear in this story that the wounded man, he ends up with marriage and all the prerogatives that go with that, and the brothers are now under a spell.
And they stay there, do they? Do they stay there permanently?
Well, I don't know. It doesn't say that actually. It says they stayed there for as long as they enjoyed relationships with the processes.
So does then imply that he who's come up and got married is a beginning, some sort of reintegration out of the liminal back into
the stories kind of assume a periodicity, a toing and froing between life and death, which comes to an end, doesn't it? I mean, that's what happens in the story. It doesn't say this is going to happen anymore.
Yeah.
Now, what's the feature of the man who gets the secrets? What is it about him which kind of entitles him to play that role?
He's got a hole in him.
What kind of hole?
An injury or something.
So, well, he's got no choice in his head necessarily. He's a wounded soldier. So a man with a wound. Okay, that's already telling you something, isn't it? He's
undergone initiation.
He's already died and come alive again. Like being wounded in battle is like kind of the nearest you can get to death, but somehow he survived that. And of course, there's the motif of the wound as a male version of menstruation, which again is, it's just kind of everywhere. The wise wound idea. So and in male initiation ritual, the men need to bleed. You'll find that all over the world. In Aboriginal Australia, in order for the men to have the power which women once had, and that's how they put it, they say we stole these secrets from women, the men have to be able to bleed in the way that women do naturally, but the men have to do artificially. Well, this man's like entitled already to do something like that because he's a wounded soldier.
Sorry, I was going to say, I'm seeing something slightly differently here, which is with the man, the married one, because this story is quite Western in a sense. Yeah. And we're comparing it with hunter-gatherers from around the world. So this is kind of like an adaptation of a particular region. This is why I'm saying the man who's married that to me implies almost kind of like the shift. And we saw this with the
that's right.
Not Beauty, the other one, the 12, whatever. But we saw the shift that. It's almost kind of like a re-emergence into a different paradigm.
Claude Lévi-Strauss, in my view, makes a big mistake. He thinks these stories are about the origin of culture, and they're actually not about that. They're about the origin of male control over culture.
Absolutely.
So in this case, it's about the origin of marriage, for example, on male terms, on patriarchal terms.
So that's how.
So the starting point is this periodicity, this toing and froing. Taking power, surrendering it, using the moon as your clock. And then, of course, we know what happened in the course of history, which was that the beginnings of agriculture meant that you couldn't plant the seeds and reap the harvest on a monthly basis. You had to wait to do things on a seasonal basis, whereupon, of course, the sun takes over, becomes much more important than the moon. So the moon gets left behind, subordinate to the sun, which in turn means that the clock in women's bodies, which is all over the world, is treated as woman's moon. The word menstruation means that. It means moon change. And that's common all over the world. That clock in your body no longer regulates the world. It's no longer like this. That clock in your body no longer counts and is replaced by other clocks based on the predominance of the sun, as we saw in the story of the Sleeping Beauty. Very, very clearly. It explicitly makes it clear that the 12 golden plates, the 12 suns, supplant the 12 silver plates of the moon. And
I'm wondering if all these tales are like that, if they all end up in that sort of way, where they represent this new paradigm.
I think you're quite right to say that all these stories are they're kind of hunter-gatherer in origin, but they're adapted to farming or patriarchal culture. And they're kind of validating the switch. So in this story, they're kind of saying the reason why you had to invent marriage, because otherwise these girls will be having too much fun. Okay. I mean, I've finished this lecture, this talk on this myth. Has anyone got any more questions or discussion or worries or I don't know any parts of the story you think haven't been adequately dealt with? Yes.
Did you just explain about the old woman? I don't think we got quite.
Well, we did.
The trickster.
Well, yes. I mean, she seems it's always the wise. It's always, first of all, these stories we call them, or we, if you think about it, we tend to call them old wives' tales. They come down. They survived. The Grimm's fairy tales, like so many others, they've survived terrible terrorism by the Christians, the Inquisition and so on. Women have kept alive these stories, preserving their logic, and you'll find again and again that the most powerful person in the stories is she has to be described as wicked, 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 otherwise the story won't get through the censorship. But wicked, wicked, wicked though she may be, she's much more powerful than any king. So in the Sleeping Beauty, it's the 13th fairy. You have to say she's wicked, but she's much more powerful than that silly king that says my daughter won't
But
read.
in Anglo-Saxon, Wicca, wicked, and all the things that are related to that root, Wicca actually means wise.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So there's the wise women, and these are old wives' tales, and they're carrying through a kind of wisdom from a time before the Christians had arrived, and probably before patriarchal religion had turned up.
Yeah.
But of course, in order to cope, they have to say wicked, wicked, wicked,
You have
wicked.
to demonise them in order to legitimise the other, what you actually, your new story, your new.
But wicked actually meant the opposite, more or less.
Yes, originally, yes. So
Like it does again now.
It's coming back.
It's bad.
Yes, somebody's got the hand up over there. Yes, hello.
I also wanted to point out that the old woman is, the wicked old woman is sort of perpetuating the patriarchal structure, sort of selling out the younger women.
She is, yeah.
Is really, that's a thing that really happens in patriarchal cultures.
Exactly, that's right. And I absolutely, totally agree with you. Yeah, she's got all that power. And maybe in an earlier period she would have used that to support those women.
Yeah.
But now she seems to be colluding with the king and all that stuff and selling out, if you like. It couldn't be more clear that she's
But
doing
that story in itself is very widespread, that the matriarchy was sold out by, well, not sold out, but that it was deliberately tampered with, and that power was passed to men.
Yeah, and well, we know from Jerome, where you hear like 3 weeks ago, Jerome told that story about the two sexes in the forest. They didn't know each other existed, and they had the women making babies in their own way with their dances, and they didn't need men, and the men were doing their stuff, didn't know women existed, and then they come together. And that story, women have a jengi. A jengi is this great raffia penis-like thing which the women have. So the women have the penis, rather like in the enactment we saw last week. So the women have this thing which makes babies, so like a big raffia, kind of ejaculating penis, as Jerome calls it. But then at the end of the story, the men have got it, and there's two versions. The men say, because we're muscular and strong, and we manage to persuade the women, with a bit of like element of threat really, to hand over this great penis, so that then from then on women would need to have sex with men to make babies. The women say, well, actually, we decided that it'd be more fun to let the men have it. Because we've retained all kinds of other secrets which we didn't give to the men, so we just gave them that thing. So there's two versions, and this story is giving the version of the women, sort of a woman voluntarily handing over to the men. But often the men, they don't want to admit that they were given anything by women. They'd rather kind of say that they were so masculine and so powerful that they were able to take stuff from women. But so there's always a bit of a tension between those two versions.
Well, nobody likes to admit that they've been given something really powerful.
Probably true. Probably true.
You did link the old woman very quickly in one of your answers with the character of the trickster, which is very important in hunter-gatherer mythology. How has that survived in these kinds, by the time it comes to Grimm's fairy tales?
Well, I think the soldier who's wounded and the old lady who talks to the soldier, I mean, they're kind of betwixt and between people, aren't they? So the trickster's always gender ambivalent, and possibly species ambivalent. Maybe some kind of shaman that wears horns or some other animal attributes. So to have magical power, shamanic power, the power of the trickster, you can't be just female, you can't be just male, you can't be just human.
You have to be a shapeshifter as well.
You have to be a shapeshifter with your own shape.
Well, also, you're tricky as well, aren't you?
You have to be tricky and part male, part female, part human, part animal, betwixt and between, in order to manage these oppositions. I mean, I'm not saying in this story that the old lady is particularly illustrating that in a powerful way to some other stories.
Yeah, but it's diluted. It's been diluted
Mhm.
due to the adaptation of the culture.
I'm more or less happy with this story because it's getting time to have a bit of a Christmas party. Is there any more questions or anything you want to ask about? Can you see how if you take the Sleeping Beauty, you take Little Red Riding Hood, you take Rapunzel, you take Jack and the Beanstalk, you take Cinderella, you take this, you've always got the similar underlying logic. You've got this world, you move to the other world, the land of the dead, you come back, and the key thing is that you can't just put anything into this world and the other world. In order to signal that it is the other world, if you're going to discuss the issue of sound, you need lots of it. If you're going to discuss the issue of light, you don't want any light. You're going to discuss the issue of cooking, you don't want any cooking in the world of the dead. And you'll find that these things go together in that way in order to make the signals loud and clear. And I wish people would just like test it out. Find me a magical story where things are put the wrong way around. I've got a few tests here at the bottom here, but I haven't found any. So, I haven't found any example of like you need lots of loud noises when you just have your honeymoon. I mean, you had to, before your honeymoon, when you're on your honeymoon, lots of noises, but when you're actually in bed with your partner, you don't want lots of saucepans clattering outside the bed
When you
window.
mention though, Chris, that there's sometimes there are contradictions to that theory. You mentioned a dinosaur was eating people in daylight.
I'm saying you can do that.
How do you differentiate between? I mean, how is that not contradicting the theory rather than reinforcing
it's just that you, as I said earlier, you can't imagine that the human brain stops you writing anything you like. So if the writer of a film script or the teller of a story, honestly, they're free to do anything. You could easily go into the land of the dead and eating roast beef. There's nothing to stop you. But I'm just suggesting that the stories which get passed on better, which get remembered better, which sort of resonate better, which make more of an impact, tend to echo previous stories.
Natural selection.
Almost like natural selection.
Yeah.
And that the end result is that your film will be more of a opposite if the dinosaurs eat you up during a thunderstorm than if you have your blue skies and something, all that stuff. It doesn't mean you can't. And I see films sometimes I just think, they're messing it all up. It's wrong. But I also think this film's naff. I don't want to see it again. I don't know why I paid my money.
Yeah. But that's the difference between genres. These are genres you're talking about, very specific, and it's exactly what you're saying.
Let me just say that the genre, the modern genre, which sticks to this best of all, are horror films. I don't like horror films particularly, but I mean, it's amazing how much the horror films fit. They really do. They really fit really well. This template.
But that's
that's another whole lecture. Yeah. But Jason Wilcox, one of my students who was here for many years, he did a little pamphlet and ended up doing a thesis, just showing how the most famous horror films beautifully mirror these patterns of fairy tales.